Today's episode of Socially Democratic is presented to you by Dunn Street. Dunn Street partners with businesses, organisations, unions and social democratic parties around the globe to train leaders, develop engagement strategies and empower people to organise for change. And in 2020, Dunn Street will continue to work with folks that want to make a difference, inspire, give hope and enable leadership to achieve their shared purpose. To find out how you can partner with us at Dunn Street, hit us up at dunstreet.com.au or indeed just follow us on our various socials, Facebook, Twitter, Instagram, and LinkedIn. Hello, and welcome to another episode of Socially Democratic, your centre-left weekly political and cultural podcast that dives into the progressive issues of the day and the people leading them from home and abroad. And today we're going back over to the United States to speak to a good friend of mine, Ross Morales Rocketto, who is the co-founder, along with Amanda Littman, the co-founder of an organisation called Run for Something, which focuses on helping young progressive people put their hand up for down-ballot races in the United States. And Ross is going to come on the show today to talk about how it all started, the work that they do, and what their focus will be in terms of getting candidates elected in the general in 13, 12, 11, 10, 9, 8 days' time. And don't also forget that this is the second podcast for the week. We had Jackie Trad, the Queensland Labor member for South Brisbane, on earlier this week. And in previous weeks, we've had Katie Parsons on, who is a Democratic strategist, and she came on and talked about the ground game over in the US. So we've got a whole bunch of US content for you as we get closer and closer to Election Day. And next week, we have got a Queensland election preview with Elliot Stein from Hawker Britain. That'll be up on Monday. And then next Thursday, I think, or Friday, we'll do our final US election campaign preview with your good friend and mine, Sam Schneidman, and Katie Conley. Katie, who was on maybe a month ago, who worked on the Pete Buttigieg campaign. They'll be joining me, and together we're going to break down the election campaign as we get ready. We'll be 4 or 5 days out from E-Day. So lots of content on the podcast coming up with reference to the elections in Queensland and in the United States. Don't forget to subscribe to the podcast on Apple Podcasts, Spotify, Stitcher, and Amazon. And if you're using Apple Podcasts, please leave us a rating and review. And for all of the updates, follow Dunn Street on Facebook, Twitter, Instagram, and LinkedIn. Let's get to today's episode. We're taping this one on a Friday morning in lockdown Melbourne. Grand final Friday, public holiday, I should say, for everyone in Victoria. But for the rest of you, you're all working across the country. We're going back stateside today. We're going to talk to a good friend of mine who is the co-founder for Run for Something, which is a progressive organisation that is all about finding young people, getting them to put their hand up and run for something in the United States. Ross Morales Rocketto, welcome to Socially Democratic.
Thanks for having me. I'm excited to be here.
So, Ross, we are going to talk a lot about Run for Something and the organisation that you have co-founded. But before we do that, just for the folks here in Australia, just give us a bit of a background of how you first got involved in Democratic campaign politics.
Yeah, when I was a kid, when I was in high school, I had a government teacher who told us that we needed to go volunteer for a campaign. I think this was my senior year of high school. So I was 17 or 18 at the time. And that was going to be a part of my grades. So I found a candidate who was running for United States Senate in Texas, which is where I grew up. And the good organizer, baby organizer that I didn't know I was at the time, I went and started volunteering. I loved it. And then I organized a bunch of people in my class to also come in and volunteer. And then by the end of that campaign, I was organizing students across the city that I lived in. So that was my first political experience. And that was back in 2001, I believe. And then from there, I caught the bug. I've worked on a couple of presidential campaigns. I worked for Senator John Edwards in 2003, 2004 in the primaries. So that was before we found out who he really was. I worked in Iowa during the 2007-2008 Iowa caucuses when President Obama won. I did not work for the Obama campaign. And then, I've worked on a bunch of statewide races. I've worked on a bunch of local races in the state of Texas. And, for those who sort of when you think of the state of Texas and you think of people riding horses to school and tractors, it's not how it really is. But that is sort of how our politics operates, or at least it did at the time. It was sort of the wild, wild west for politics. And, to some degree, it still is. In Texas, there are no campaign finance limits, so anybody can give as much money as they want to a political campaign. So eventually, I got really burned out on politics. I worked for a lot of races. I worked on a lot of consecutive election cycles. I just got to a place where I felt like everyone that I was working for who had I was just working for people who had a D next to their name for Democrat. And a lot of them really sucked, to be totally honest. And so I took a little bit of a break. I went to grad school. I went and did consulting for a few years. And then I sort of felt the calling and decided that I would get back. But when I came back, I wanted to make sure I did it on my own terms. So I went and worked for sort of a legendary organizer named Paul Tews, who had a consulting firm at the time. And then the 2016 election cycle happened. I was working at a large super PAC that was organized by labor unions at the time. It was a really great experience. We built a massive operation that knocked on over 10 million doors. And then, election night happened. And I knew that I couldn't go back to what I was doing before. And, if you ask me now, what I thought I was going to do after 2016, I thought I was probably going to go back out into the field again. I went out and managed a U.S. congressional race that was in a special election right after 2016, so at the very beginning of 2017. And at that point, honestly, I thought I was going to bounce around the country, running sort of progressive upstart, gubernatorial campaigns or Senate races, things like that. And then as it happened, I ended up getting connected to Amanda, who's my co-founder. And she and I, she was connected to me through my wife, who also worked with her on the Hillary Clinton campaign. And Amanda was thinking about sort of what the original nugget of what Run for Something was. And my wife connected us because she was like, well, Ross has been thinking about something really similar for a long time. I think the two of you should actually talk. And we did. And we started writing some plans. We put together a website. We put a form up. And then on Inauguration Day in 2017, we launched, thinking that Run for Something would be a side hustle, that if we were really lucky, maybe 100 people would sign up to run for office in the first year. We put the form up, we launched, 1,000 people signed up in the first day, 10,000 people signed up in the first few months. And since then, we've had over 60,000 people tell us that they're interested in running for office.
I've always loved that story. The first time I heard it, when I first met you, I think it was at a conference in Brussels, was just remarkable. We'll just build a website, we'll put out an email, we'll see who's interested, and as you described, a bit of a side hustle. And here we are, in 2020. And we'll talk more about where you guys are right now and what you're looking at as you're sort of 12, 13 days out from Election Day. But it's just remarkable how there's a great song in Australian pop culture from a famous Australian artist called Paul Kelly, and the song is actually about Indigenous rights, but it's called From Little Things, Big Things Grow. And I think that song applies to certainly the work that you and Amanda have done with Run for Something. It's remarkable. So what planted the seeds for you personally? What was going on in your mind at that time for you to think we need to sort of there's a space here in democratic campaign politics where we need to give support to candidates or identifying candidates and giving them support? How did you start to? Where were the seeds planted for you?
The seeds were initially planted years ago when I decided to get out of politics. or try something else for a few years. I just, you know, like, as I said a little bit earlier, like, I just had worked for so many shitty people, like, over and over and over again. I'd work for like a candidate, and they would turn out to be like not what I thought they were going to be, or they represented themselves to be something different than they were. And that just like happened so many times. And, you know, like, I've worked for some really, really amazing people, like Julian Castro, who ran for president of the United States and is the former housing secretary, is one of those folks. But, you know, in my own personal life, I know so many amazing individuals who would make such good elected officials. And it just became so clear to me, you know, all the way back, I think it probably was like 2010 or 2011, or it was actually 2009 when I sort of like decided I want to try a few other things. And, you know, like, I knew that when I got back into politics, I wanted to do it on my own terms. I didn't want to do it on anyone else's. I wanted to make sure that I was doing it for the right reasons. And I wanted to make sure that when I did, that I was working with the types of people that I really, truly thought should be getting elected. And, you know, I think the thing that I learned getting to be at a lot of large organizations and going to grad school, you know, like working in a 100,000 person plus company at Deloitte, was that there are a lot of ways to change systems, but one of the most efficient ways to change the system is to change the people who go into the system. And so that was sort of the point, you know, that like the initial ideas of like, I think what Run for Something could be in my mind started to begin. And I think, you know, Amanda comes at it from a very different angle, you know, where after election day, she was talking to a friend who was thinking about, you know, who said, you know, if like Donald Trump can be president, like I can run to be on my school board, but I don't know how to get started and I don't know like where to find resources. And so I think because we are coming at it from very different places, but with basically the same intention in mind, I think we are able to make something really powerful because we are able to build off of each other's ideas.
Am I right in this perception about candidates in the United States or people who are successful in seeking public office, that they tend to be white, upper middle class, college educated, professional background, professional careerist type political people in the first instance, and obviously reasonably wealthy? Is that a fair representation of what people look like in public office?
Yeah, I mean, it's like white dudes who are lawyers. Like that's who sort of like when most people think of who a politician is, it's like a white guy in a suit who either has a law degree or who like ran some like business, and, you know, like doesn't need an income and is able to, you know, like retire or take some time off from the business and like run for office. But that's like mostly what people think of. Also always a little bit older. So, you know, well, I'll let you ask the question before I start on that tangent.
No. Well, I mean, my follow-up was then, what are the common themes that you discovered amongst the candidates that had previously prevented them from putting their hand up to now making this leap to public office? Was it a matter of, because you started to touch on it there, that conversation that Amanda had with one of her colleagues, and there was I don't know how to do it, or I don't know where I'll get the resources, or is it what are the barriers that you had discovered existed that were stopping young people from running for something?
Yeah, I think at its most basic level, it came down to the idea of like, you can't be what you can't see. There just aren't a lot of examples. There haven't been a lot of examples of, you know, like folks from traditionally marginalized backgrounds like running for office, and most people haven't seen them. Barack Obama is like the one that you can sort of point to, but, you know, like the numbers of like the statistics around people who are elected, you know, like are like quite staggering. And they especially were back in 2016 and 2017, you know, like 60, 70, 80% white, you know, 60, 70, 80% male, 60, 70, 80% over the age of 50 or 55. And I think like the place that was really the most difficult for people to start was like imagining themselves like running for office in the first place. I think that's there are a lot of things about the 2016 election that I think started to break apart some of those ideas. And I think truthfully, one of them is the fact that Donald Trump was extremely unqualified, running against one of the most qualified people to run for president of the United States ever in our history. And he won. And I think a lot of people after that said to themselves, well, if that guy is qualified to be president, then like I must be qualified to do something in my local community. And a thing that we found, we did some research on folks in our pipeline and who told us that they were interested in running for office. And a thing that we really consistently found is that the people who tended to who tended to become candidates those folks were a lot less likely to mention Donald Trump when they were asked the question, why are you running for office? And they were much more likely to mention something like, I'm running to solve a problem in my local community, or I'm running because there's nobody that looks like me at the decision-making table, or, like all of these other reasons for it. But I do think that Donald Trump, while I don't think Donald Trump is the reason people are running, and we see that in the data, I do think that his election catalyzed things for people and started to change the way that they think about a lot of this stuff. I think, and then on top of all of those things, right, it's really like running for office. I don't know what it's like in other countries. Running for office in the United States is really difficult because we have a federalist system. So like, all of the work that Run for Something does, like none of it is federal. All of it is state and local. And that means all of the laws about running for office are different across all 50 states and often are different county to county. And so, like even like things as simple and straightforward as getting on the ballot are really, really difficult and and they're not transparent and they're difficult to figure out. And then on top of that, I think a lot of people just like don't, when they start in politics and when they start running, they don't really, like there's no one there. There's traditionally been no one there or very few folks there to say, like, here's what running a campaign is actually about. It's not as complicated as you think it is. It's about talking to voters. It's about telling people who you are, why you're running, and what your values are. And like at its core, right, like it's like running for office is a lot like sort of like any type of like marketing campaign or persuasion campaign, right, that you would run in any other sector. The difference is that like the product is the candidate, like rather than, like a widget or like, a thing of toilet paper or like whatever it is. And so, a big part of what we try to do is we try to break things down for folks in a way that is easily digestible, is easy to understand. And also just like making sure that people understand how to get off the ground, like what is the local bank that most of the political candidates use, who understand sort of like how the filings have to work. Like where do I find the information about how to do campaign finance or file my campaign finance reports? Things that are really basic like that are just so hard in the United States. And, like, I think that was sort of like the place where we started. We sort of like, we've grown out from there, but like that, I think was like really like the core of like where Run for Something began.
I'm going to ask you about the pipeline that you take those candidates on in terms of a journey in a moment. But before I do, I actually just realized I should actually get you to explain to the folks here in Australia or outside the United States that listen to this podcast, what are the types of races or ballots do you target? So when you talk about, when we always hear this expression down-ballot races, just to give people a bit of an understanding of what are the kind of races that you're getting people to run for or encouraging them to do, I should say.
Yeah, so it's things like city council, town council, county councils, school boards, county executives, like small town mayors. In the United States, we still have dog catcher, mosquito board, state, also state legislature. Anything that is, we do anything that is not statewide and anything that is not federal.
Mm-hmm.
So we don't do anything for Congress or Senate. We don't do folks who are running for governor or any of those types of statewide offices. But like basically anything that you can run for in the United States that is like below those levels, we will like work with people on.
Everyone knows about the dog catcher. And I've actually never asked this question. Why do we need to elect a dog catcher? I've never asked that. I've actually just always thought about it, and we've all made jokes about it, but I've actually never bothered asking an American, why are we electing dog catchers?
I think they were more of a problem like back in the day. There aren't a lot of dog catcher positions left. But I think it was more, I think like roving bands of dogs were more of a problem like way
Right.
back in the day.
Yeah, exactly.
Than they are now.
I was thinking that. How many stray dogs are there in America right now that you actually need to even have that job title, really? Like, can't it just be wrapped into some sort of Parks and Rec sort of position?
Yeah, and in most cities now, like, they have that, like that, like it's like a government position and you don't have to run for it. But, like mosquito board in Florida, there are mosquito boards. That's like a real thing. And, if you've ever been to Florida, mosquitoes are a real problem here. So
Indeed. Okay, sorry. I really just needed to ask you that question. I feel a lot better now. I will sleep much better this evening now knowing the genesis of the dog catcher. Let's talk about the pipeline, the journey that you take a candidate on. So I decide that I'm living in upstate Maine in a small town and I'm not happy with my local mayor, and I go on the Run for Something website and I put in my contact details. What happens next?
Yeah, and so actually, probably what you would do now, we've evolved a little bit, is you would look up the things that you can run for in your local community. We have like a lookup tool called runforwhat.net that you can go look up your address and it'll tell you all the things that you can run for in your area. From there, you'll get a series of follow-up emails and text messages from Run for Something that sort of like take you through like the journey of being a candidate. And so, one of those things that you'll get like basically immediately will ask you to sign up for a phone call, for a conference call, where you will get to talk to one of like a Run for Something staff member on a like large call. We talk about like what running for office is like, what it isn't like. We talk about what Run for Something does and what we don't do. And then for folks who are interested in moving on to the next step, this is like a point where we sort of like push people into different parts of the funnel. If you're like not sure what you want to run for, but you're interested in learning more, we put you into a funnel to have a one-on-one with a volunteer. And then eventually you have that one-on-one with a volunteer, you get to talk to them, you like get a little bit more resources, you get access to sort of like Run for Something's library of resources and things that exist. And then we continue basically to serve content to you about running for office, what it's like, we did a masterclass series earlier this year about sort of, with like really high level political operatives across the Democratic space, like talking about what it's like running in a pandemic and like what candidates can do and what people who are thinking about running can do. And so, we have a whole program for all of those folks. And we regularly check in with them to find out if they're still thinking about running, like where they are in their journey. Then we have another part of the pipeline for people who are like, I am absolutely running. I'm running this year. I'm running for this office. And then we put those folks into basically what is our endorsement pipeline. So they get a questionnaire. We ask them to fill out a bunch of questions, ask them about why they're running, what their values are. And, like we get into details like, what's your win number? What do you think your campaign budget is? Like, give us a summary of your campaign plan. We have folks on the team, we have like a multi-step vetting process. We do a first round of sort of like high level vets on candidates that just like look at, criminal background history, social media, et cetera. Folks who get through that round then get vetted by a member of the Run for Something team. those folks look through. So like, they're really looking for like, do these candidates align with our values? Are they thinking about their campaigns in a way that aligns with like what Run for Something's trying to do, that kind of stuff. And then from there, we like have a sort of like crew of people across the United States who we reach out to try to get some more local context for each one of those folks. And then from there, like we make endorsements. And to date, we've made over 1,500 endorsements over the last 4 years. We made over 620 in this election cycle, and we have probably about 520 or so folks who are having elections on election day. The sort of discrepancy in the number is we had folks lose we have folks who lose or win in their primaries, or are running in local races where their election day is actually not in November because, again, in the United States, like nothing is uniform, and cities and counties can basically just like decide when their election days are in a lot of places. So we had a handful of cities and counties that had elections over the summer that don't have anything following up in November.
Two or three questions out of that pipeline that I have now. The first one maybe is more of a comment and an experience here in Australia than a question, but I'd be interested to get your thoughts on this. Early in the pipeline, you talked about we run a session where we tell them what public office or what a campaign looks like and what a campaign doesn't look like, or what public office can be and what it isn't. My experience as a Labor Party official has been that I think that a lot of our candidates who do put their hand up for public office, that conversation needs to happen earlier, because I think a lot of them have an expectation of what public office looks like and what running for public office looks like, as opposed to the reality. A clear moment for me was I won't say what year it was and I won't say what race it was because I don't want to embarrass these particular candidates, but we ran a training for the candidates, specifically focusing on organising and leading to direct voter contact. And at the end of the training, which went for a day, we said, right, now we're going to make some calls. We're actually going to call some voters and we're going to see how you are in terms of making persuasion calls. And you've never seen 20 candidates look busy trying to get busy to do something else than make those calls. The look of fear in their eyes that they realised that they had to go and talk to a voter was, it was so obvious in the room. They all of a sudden picked up the phone and were taking calls from their campaign manager, or, they had to go to the bathroom and they never came back again and that kind of stuff. And I was like, oh my God, no one sat down with them and told them that you got to talk to people. So that, is that a common occurrence in the States at that point of the pipeline as well that you found?
Yeah, I would say the thing that, because, like our systems are different, like candidates have to raise a lot of all of their own money. So actually the part of the process where you actually see that is call time. So like, for those who don't know, call time is what it sounds like. You sit down in a windowless room with your campaign manager or a finance assistant or some combination of the two. You get a list in front of you of donors. Usually, you start with your friends and family, and then you expand there. Each name on the list has a dollar amount next to them. And you pick up the phone and you call them and you ask every one of those people for money. And most candidates hate it. Actually, that's not true. Every candidate, with like one or two exceptions that I've run into, hates doing call time. It doesn't ever feel good to ask people for money. And especially because, it's really transactional. Even when you're like connecting to people on a deep level, like you're still asking them for money and you're probably going to ask them for money again if they don't max out to you. And so that's the part where I think we have a lot of candidates who don't understand how much they're going to hate it. And actually a lot of our candidates like love voter contact because it's so refreshing. It's so much better than like talking to voters is so much better than begging people for money. Yeah. That like, I actually think because it's like asking people for money is so terrible, that like it makes the candidates like voter contact a lot more. They're like, oh my God, I love getting on the phone with voters and just like talking to them about why I'm running for office, or like knocking on their door, you know, like when we are knocking on people's doors. So yeah, for us, the equivalent is call time. And I would say almost every candidate I've ever worked with has a hard time with it at the beginning.
I think that's something that
many continue to have a hard time, like well into it. So
I have a great idea. I think that in order to get our candidates to enjoy speaking to voters, we're going to introduce call time as well, because also, you know, small dollar fundraising is an important component of campaigning. So that's a recommendation I'll make to my brothers and sisters at the Labor Party. The second thing I picked up from that journey was the bit where you got to a stage where you're working out whether or not you would endorse a candidate, and there were questions around, do they align with our values? How did Run for Something define what our values look like?
Yeah, so when we started with the idea that, like, first of all, we didn't want to be the purity police. There are a lot of parts of the progressive movement who are going to have like, you know, like you have to believe in like X or Y policy. We're working with such a diverse part of the ballot in terms of just like what the responsibilities are for those different offices, that we didn't feel like we could do that in any sort of way that made sense. And so where we started was, you know, and actually like where we started, which is like where most candidates actually need to be starting, is like, what are the values that we really do care about? And so from there, that actually made things a lot easier for us. And I think they're pretty straightforward. You know, like we're asking people if they if they believe in LGBTQ equality. We're asking people, you know, if they believe that like Black Lives Matter. We're asking people if they believe that climate change is real, caused by humans, and that the government should do something about it. We're asking people whether they believe, you know, that working people deserve a leg up, and that the government should do everything that it can, like, to support working folks. You know, like it's really, it's really basic stuff. We also do, you know, there's a handful of things we have like very specific questions on. You know, like we do ask a question about choice. And, you know, for us, it's really important for candidates to be pro-choice. It's like, it is a line that we draw in the sand. You know, I often say like, we don't want folks who are soft on it, because what we know from experience is that candidates who are soft on it like end up returning to where their values are when they end up having a tough vote to make. And so like if somebody is soft, or, you know, they don't believe in it personally, but like they don't want to, you know, put their religious views on other people, for us, like we're just, the answer is yes or no. Do you support, you know, like women's reproductive freedom and the right to choose? Yes or no. Like there aren't a lot of things that we don't, you know, like include some nuance on. That is like one of the very few things. And honestly, like we thought that might be a problem at the beginning in places like Alabama and Mississippi and Georgia, you know, like other places like throughout the South. It turns out not to have really been much of an issue at all. Like the people who are applying for our endorsement, the people that we're recruiting, like tend to be like to believe in these values. We do give people the opportunity to tell us a little bit more about like why they believe in them and things like that. And you'd be surprised at the things that people say and the way that people sometimes sabotage themselves when they answer those types of questions. You know, we had someone running for city council who like really wanted to write a screed about immigration, and he seemed really great. And then like we read his, like what he wrote about immigration, and we were like, yeah, that's just like a no from us. And, you know, we tend to be really generous with the candidate. So like if somebody writes something in there that we think maybe they didn't mean the way that like we interpreted it, we usually give them an opportunity to explain if they would like to. But, you know, sometimes people just say things and you're like, all right, you should, when somebody shows you who they are, believe them the first time.
Yeah. And the final point out of that pipeline is you talked about the diversity of your candidates, and I think that's one of the success stories of Run for Something. But it's easy to be an organisation or to say, right, we want to have a more diverse looking set of people that we're going to bring into this organisation. To say you want to do it is one thing, to make it happen is another. How have you been successful in making that happen?
Yeah, I think that has been, and I'll be totally honest, that has been a challenge since we first started. And it's also part of why we set our goals the way that we did. Like, we really believe in taking an intersectional approach to our candidates' diversity. We look at a lot of different facets of candidates, but when we first started, the thing that we said is that we wanted at least 50% of our candidates to be women, at least 50% to identify as a person of color, and at least 20% to identify as LGBTQ. We didn't hit most of those goals at the very beginning, in large part because people were coming to us, right? And it turns out that the people who raise their hands the fastest and easiest tend to be white dudes.
I can do that.
And so at the very
yeah, I'll totally do that.
At the very beginning, we had a really hard time. And honestly, the way that we ended up going about that journey, we had to learn a lot. We had to fail a ton, and we did. For the first 2 or 3 years, we didn't hit our diversity numbers. We came close. We were usually around 48, 49% women, usually somewhere between 40 and 45% people of color. Usually we were around 20% for LGBTQ folks. But over and over again, we didn't hit it. And honestly, what it just took is it took investment. It took an investment of time, energy, resources, money, into, making sure that we were able to do it. And I think the thing is, we operate in a system that we don't have a lot of control over. We do recruit people, we do support people, but a lot of people who are signing up to run are just signing up to run, or are being recruited by the party, or being recruited by other people. And so, we're also to some degree dealing with the group of people that are already out there. And a thing that we had to get really clear on internally was what were our priorities? We got a lot of applications from mediocre white dudes. And, a thing that we came to after the first year or so is we didn't actually have to endorse those folks. We were looking at those applications, we were reviewing them, and we were saying there's no reason not to endorse this person. There also wasn't always a compelling reason to endorse them. And so the thing that we really had to sit down and get clear on was how are we going to look at those applications? And so, we implemented something we call a hell yeah test. So if you basically looked at the application and your answer was and you didn't say yeah, that person's awesome, then we didn't have to make an endorsement. We don't have to endorse everyone. And then from there, we just had to get really proactive. We spent a lot of time researching folks who are running. We spent a lot of time investing in our own pipeline and diversifying the pipeline of the 60,000 people who have told us they want to run for office, to make sure that because that's that's a core place where we get a lot of our candidates from. So we needed to make sure that group of folks was a lot more diverse. And then this year actually is the first year for an entire year where we hit all of our diversity goals. But the thing is that that's great, but it's also a journey. So now we're going to set new goals. And, I would say, just being totally honest, we under index for, we have way fewer Latinx candidates than we should. We have fewer AAPI candidates than we should. And so, a thing that we're going to spend a lot of time and energy on, this next year is making sure we get more AAPI candidates into the pipeline, more Latinx candidates into the pipeline, and also sort of like remembering the fact that like we can't control everything, but like we need to make sure that we're doing everything within our power to make sure that we do it. And it had to be, the only way that it works is if it is a large scale organizational priority and that everybody is pushing towards the same thing. So like our digital person is, you know, who's like in charge of our ads, is making sure that like our ads are targeted at like diverse constituencies, that like our comms is like focused on, our comms folks are focused on like publications that are read by people of color, you know, that the team, that our programs team, you know, like is reaching out to candidates that might not traditionally get the help of the party because like they don't look like, you know, what we sort of like, you know, would normally think of a candidate looking like. And it also for us means that we endorse and will have to endorse in a lot of primaries, because that's where a lot of women and a lot of people of color and a lot of young people end up losing. Like the reason that we don't have the diversity of candidates that like we should have in the United States is because it's necessarily because those folks don't run. A lot of them do run, but a lot of them lose when they do run because they don't get any institutional support. And so, you know, a really good example is in the state of Pennsylvania this year, it is not every, but it is almost every competitive state legislative district has a white person running for it. And, you know, like we're in the year of our Lord 2020, and that's not acceptable at this point. Like we can do better and we need to do better.
The midterms, I'm assuming, would have been your first big test after setting up Run for Something in 2017. Talk us through some of the successes that you had from that 2018 midterm in terms of giving support to candidates, but also what were the lessons that came out of that then have propelled you to prepare for this general?
Yeah, a big thing that we learned out of that election cycle was that candidates needed a couple of things, right? We all know that candidates need money and volunteers, right? Like that's the easy stuff, like everyone knows it, super straightforward. What candidates need, there's actually a couple of things that we learned. One, we learned that candidates need different things at different parts of their journey. So at the very beginning of their journey, what they actually need is like encouragement, and they need to see that someone is there and has their back. So like literally just the act of being there and endorsing them and like talking to them and telling them that you have your back is like basically like one of the most important things that like they like need to feel. They need to feel supported. And then sort of beyond that, at that point, that's like when a lot of them need training, right? So that's when we go through their campaign plans, and that's when we like, if a lot of sometimes they don't have campaign plans, and that's when we like help them write campaign plans, or that's when we look at their budgets and we say your budget's all wrong. We're gonna have to work together to fix it. So that's when we really dig in a lot of the nuts and bolts and sort of like do a lot of the like coaching. Like there's like a lot of coaching that happens at that beginning stage. You know, then towards like the middle part, once they like figure out how their campaign works, how things are going, you know, they need to know that there's someone that they can sort of like call on that is like a third party, like an independent validator who they can just sort of like bounce ideas off of. That like is more, and that ends up in sort of like a mentor like type of a role. And then at the end, you know, it sort of switches again back to like, you know, we're helping them with their GOTV plans. We're making sure that like they have a plan for like what they're going to do around paid communications for election day, things like that. But the thing that we saw that they sort of like that candidates really wanted and craved through the entire process was to be connected to other people who are going through the same experience as them. So we built a bunch of programs for that and piloted a few this year in 2020. You know, one of them was like we hosted a series of like webinars with candidates like in the same state or like around specific areas so that they could sort of like talk to each other and get to know each other better, and like people who are dealing with some of the same problems. So we like did like a webinar for for parents who are running for office and like what they were dealing with. And this is like in the middle of the pandemic. We created an alumni mentorship program. And so, we have, at the end of the cycle, we'll have close to about 2,000 alum, like who have been endorsed by Run for Something. Whenever someone goes through an election, we ask if they're interested in giving back. And one of the primary ways that they can give back is by mentoring another candidate who's running. And so we actually like match them to make sure that they can get connected. The earlier that happens, the better. I think in the upcoming election cycles, we're going to start to explore more ways that we can facilitate sort of like one-to-one like relationships, or like ways that we can connect some of the same candidates in the state to make sure that they're talking to each other, things like that. I think we underestimated the relationship building piece with the candidates, and how much of our work, there's a nuts and bolts part to like the work and making sure that they're running good campaigns and things like that. But, so much of it is like helping them deal with how hard and shitty running for office is, to be honest.
Yeah.
It really sucks.
Who, going into the 2020 campaign, is there one or two candidates that is worth sharing their story for us? And maybe I think it'd be worthwhile anyone listening to this podcast to actually just go check them out, and something to look at in terms of a backstory going into election day and watching the coverage, as we all will be doing on Wednesday, the day after election in the States with the time zones. Who's some candidates out there that we should go check out, and who've got some pretty amazing backstories that you guys are endorsing?
Yeah, I would. So I'm going to give a plug here to the Run for Something podcast. You can go to runforsomething.net/podcast. And the reason I'm doing that, it's not just a shameless plug, even though it is a shameless plug, is that we, like, every week we interview a candidate to learn more about their backstory, and get people sort of like create some transparency for people so they can see who these folks really are. The most recent episode is about a woman named Kim Jackson. She's running for state senate in Georgia. She is openly LGBTQ. She's also an Episcopalian minister. She grew up like in a really rural part of South Carolina, and sort of like her story of getting from a small town in South Carolina to being a minister at one of the wealthiest churches in Atlanta, to ministering to some of the poorest people in the city of Atlanta, and then running for state senate on top of all of that, while also dealing with the fact that when she came out to her family, it created a ton of tension. It's a really moving story, and I would like highly recommend it. There's just like so many like amazing candidates. We have this last cycle, and I just like want to mention her because I think she's like one of like sort of like the shining stars in like the future of the Democratic Party, is a woman named Lena Hidalgo, who ran for a position that is called county judge in Harris County, Texas. Harris County is basically the county that encompasses Houston, and it's the, I think, second or third largest county in America. Lena ran for that position in 2018 as a 28-year-old who had never held elected office before. She's an immigrant from Colombia, and she was underestimated basically every step of the way, including after she got elected. She's basically the mayor of like one of the largest counties in America, and she got elected immediately, sort of started to get undermined by both Democrats and Republicans, to be honest, who sort of, I think there were a lot of people who wanted to see her fail. And then, she has been one of the best sort of like state, like elected officials in the state of Texas when it comes to COVID. She's like one of the few folks who's followed the science. She has worked really hard to actually keep things apolitical, so that she could also be talking to Republicans, making sure people were wearing masks. She implemented one of the state's first contact tracing programs. So like she's one of the folks in the state who took it the most seriously, the quickest. And then on top of that, she's also like managed, people don't know a lot about Houston. I'm sure Houston gets a lot of hurricanes. She's managed multiple natural disasters, a chemical explosion fire. And then on top of all of that, she, along with the new city clerk in the city of Houston, are overseeing basically what seems to be right now one of the most successfully implemented elections in like the state of Texas right now. Early vote started, I think about 10 or 11 days ago in the state of Texas, and Harris County is outperforming the rest of the state by like orders of magnitude because of like so many of the initiatives that she and the city clerk were able to implement. So, that's like someone that I would just like keep an eye on and watch. We have a woman named Jennifer Carroll Floyd, who originally ran for office in 2017 for state assembly in Virginia. She's now running for governor of the state of Virginia. Only a few years later. She's amazing. We have a woman named Anna Scamani who's running for state legislature in Florida. She's an incredible sort of like progressive voice. She's the first Iranian American to ever serve I think like as an elected official in the state of Florida. And she's definitely has a super bright future. She will run for statewide office in the state of Florida in the not too distant future, I'm sure. So
I'm conscious of the time because the debate's going to start quite soon, so we should wrap it up. But I've got a couple more questions I just want to throw at you. The first one really more is an opportunity for you to vent than anything, okay? Because I get the sense from both you and Amanda on your Twitter feed that whenever there is, particularly after the passing away of Ruth Bader Ginsburg, obviously a lot of Democratic donor money started pouring into Senate races, and you guys were on Twitter screaming, going, "You can donate money elsewhere as well. You can look at down-ballot races." How hard is it to get cut through when we're in an election cycle that is so geared towards the presidential, and barely we could talk about the Senate? Like, for you guys, how are you getting people's attention to start pumping money into supporting these great candidates?
Being on Twitter is one of them, even though I wish I didn't have to be on Twitter. It's really hard, truthfully. Like it's an almost impossible task not because people don't understand, not because people don't think it's important. I actually do think people believe it is important, but because the urgency feels different than sort of the urgency of the presidential or the urgency of the Senate. It's much easier for people to make a one-to-one connection between like donating to the president, to Joe Biden for president, and like donating to Mark Kelly for US Senate in Arizona, and sort of like the change that they'll see that way. I think people don't honestly, most people don't even understand like what state legislatures do. Most people don't understand that what gerrymandering is. Most people don't understand, like what their local city councils and county councils and school boards actually do for them, even though they actually do the vast majority of the governing. Most people feel like the federal government is the entity that's doing the most for them. And so I think that it's not just voters, right? It's also donors, it's political operatives. State legislative races and down-ballot races in the United States are as sexy as they have ever been in my time working in politics, and that's since 2001. And a really fun, it's not a fun fact, Joe Biden raised like what, 160, 170 million, something like that. I can't quite remember the exact number, in the month of August. Every single Democratic state legislative candidate in the United States combined at that point in August has raised less money through the whole year than Joe Biden did in the month of August. And so, has some of that changed through late money? Yeah. A lot of our candidates have been able, starting in the end, sort of middle to end of September, going into October, like started to raise more money. Is it the amount of money that they actually need to run the races that they need to? It's not enough. It's honestly never enough at like this level of the ballot. And so I think in normal times, right, you know, the thing that a lot of these candidates can lean back on is the ability to do grassroots organizing work, to knock on doors, to have one-on-one conversations with voters. And we didn't have that this cycle. And so the money actually became orders of magnitude more important this cycle than in previous cycles, because, you know, this cycle, the phones are good. Having a phone conversation with a voter is good. Text message is good. Having a text message conversation with a voter is good. Nothing is going to replace a door knock. And so, you know, that's why we see, you know, there's candidates running for state legislature in the state of Texas right now there's a candidate who just spent $1 million on television for the last like 2 weeks of the election, like that, you know. And so our Texas friends are a little bit unique. They're outliers because it got sexy on the internet to donate to Texas state legislative candidates over the last 3 weeks, which is great. A+, I love it. It's, you know, and there are also other state legislative candidates who need money. So yeah, it's always hard.
Speaking of sexy Texas, how are you feeling generally about the state? Some polls have come out in the last couple of days that are showing it's either even, or I think there was a Morning Consult this morning, I think had Biden up by 1 point. So, you know, obviously within the margin of error, but are you feeling good about Texas generally, your home state?
I am cautiously optimistic about the entire map right now. I don't know if Joe Biden is going to win the state of Texas. The voters in Texas will decide. And honestly, turnout in Texas has been absolutely bonkers so far, like this year, like through early vote. I think they're at about, through the first 10 or so days of early vote, now they're at about 65% of total turnout from 2016. Which means they're just going to crush through the 2016 number. I've never seen anything. I've never seen turnout like that in Texas before. I don't think anyone's ever seen turnout in Texas like that before. And so, you know, people are definitely jazzed about the election. Does that mean Joe Biden's going to win? I don't know. What I do think, though, is that I think there's a real opportunity for us to flip the Texas State House, which doesn't sound sexy at all, but it is very sexy. Because the moment we flip the Texas State House, it puts into motion sort of like a chain reaction of events that's going to lead to Texas becoming a purple state, and is also going to lead to Republicans having to play on defense in like a state with a ton of electoral votes. And so I think the Texas State House is probably like is one of the most interesting places to watch this election cycle. There's a bunch of other states where we have chances to flip. Arizona, I'm optimistic about. Michigan, we have a chance to flip that state house. It's a narrow path, but we have really good candidates there. North Carolina, there's like a path to flipping the state house, and we have like some amazing candidates there. The state of Pennsylvania also has a path. So I think what I would say is that what we know from doing this work for the last 4 or 5 years is that, you know, and what we've seen in polling is that Joe Biden is polling well in a lot of these districts, but Joe Biden doesn't have coattails for most of these candidates. And that's fine, because actually what's going to end up happening is these candidates are going to get extra votes for Joe Biden and are going to push up the top of the ticket. And that's why it's so critical for us to consistently be recruiting good candidates who represent their districts, who have the same lived and shared experiences as the like people living in their areas, and who understand like how to talk to those voters. And like having those people there is like basically a multiplier effect. We're going to get, you know, we're going to get more votes in every one of those districts. That adds up at the state level. That adds up, you know, at the national level. And, you know, like if you think about it, like most U.S. presidential elections come down to pretty slim vote margins. Like those are sometimes like winning vote margins just by like having really good local candidates running.
Well, we will all find out in 12 days' time. What's your plan? What does your day look like on election day?
Probably doing a lot of meditating to keep myself calm. No, I mean, I'm going to volunteer. I'll probably send text messages and make phone calls during the day to a handful of our candidates. At night, we have we're going to have to be watching 500 plus elections. So we have like a large election watch operation that's sort of like an all hands on deck kind of thing. Usually we like to do it in person. This year we can't do it in person because of COVID, but we'll be doing it over Zoom. And I'm going to be doing everything I can to keep my mind occupied on election day. It's going to be a weird one. Usually on presidential election days, I'm like running a program that's like for the presidential election, and sort of like in this role, I run for something that's just like it's not what I do and it's not what we do. And so I'm gonna have to keep myself busy. Actually thinking about it just makes me a little bit nervous.
I know. Oh, no. Well, look, Ross, first of all, thank you very much for your time today, particularly so close to the election. I do appreciate you taking a good solid hour out of your day to come and talk to us. I've always found, since I first met you, both you and the work that you guys are doing at Run for Something incredibly inspiring. And so I'm just rapt that you had the opportunity to come and talk to both a whole bunch of Australians and folks outside of the US about the great work that you guys are doing. So we just wish you the best of luck to you and all your candidates across the country on the first Tuesday in November.
Thanks for having me. I really appreciate it. This is really fun. It's always great getting to talk to you.